Well, good morning. So we're here for this splendid event, and I am so happy to see everyone here this morning. And I'm sure there's some casualties from last night's festive board. Some of you may be walking wounded this morning, but thank you for being here. It's an honor to be your opening speaker. I've had a lot of different ideas about how I was going to do this talk. And at one point I was working on a nice PowerPoint. I was going to have lots of images up there for you to look at. And I decided, no, I don't want to do that. The last time I spoke in this lodge, I did one of the things that I love to do. And that is to engage you as participants, not just an audience. And I'm going to do that today. That's what I decided to do. So I'm going to be asking some questions relevant to this idea of nurturing the Renaissance of Masonry in the 21st century. And I welcome your input along the way. I'm going to have some things that I want to say about that. I'm privileged with the position to be able to speak my thoughts about it, and I'm going to take advantage of that. But I really want to hear what you have to say, and I suspect that just about everything that I'm thinking of saying, someone else out here in this room is also thinking of. There may be a few little differences here or there, but there are lots of people in this room who are intelligent, inspired, experienced, whether it's in Masonry or not. It may be relevant to our conversation here today. And so I would welcome anybody to contribute to this discussion. Let me get my computer up and running here so that I can keep track of what's going on. And also make sure that I don't run out of time or overtime. All right. So let's start with this idea of the Masonic Renaissance. This is something that I've been encouraging brothers now for a few years to recognize, that we're in the midst of a Renaissance in the Masonic fraternity. And so my first question to you is just simply, what does a Renaissance mean? Anybody? Rebirth. Quite literally. What else? How else would you say that that word is significant? Beyond its literal meaning, what does it imply or suggest? That there's interest. That there is interest. Say more about that.
Well, rebirth is just, for me, something being put aside and carrying out of nowhere. The genesis of the Renaissance is that there's interest, particularly in the object or the idea, enough to give it enough attention where it develops its own energy.
All right. So for anyone who couldn't hear what he was just saying, he's talking about how a Renaissance at a cultural level, I'm going to put that in there as a way of kind of qualifying it, happens because there's a growing interest in something actually coming to be or changing in some way to have a rebirth. What other thoughts are there about the significance of the word Renaissance? Yes?
A lot of times there seems to be a lot of new inspiration. You see a lot of innovation and things that are new.
Oh my goodness, he used the I word, innovation. I don't know if you're from a Masonic jurisdiction like mine, where that word innovation is kind of considered to be a dirty word, but But yes, that's a wonderful suggestion through the term Renaissance, is that it's a time where inspiration is welcome, innovation, creativity is part of a Renaissance. I mean, and why wouldn't it be? The idea of creativity and birth are naturally connected with each other. I'm going to go back to Doug.
Thinking how the era, the historical era of the Renaissance greatly revered the past
Yes.
and the chain of initiatives through history that brought the wisdom forward to the generations.
Very significant point. Yes. So one of the things that Doug is pointing out is that that period of Western or of European history that we refer to as the Renaissance, that one of the key principles, driving principles of that Renaissance was a reverence for the past, for key figures, for key ideas, practices, looking to the past for wisdom that could assist this transformation into something new. That's a key point. Yes, and go to Jeriel.
And also as these realizations become more and more common, that it sets off chain reactions, and that as people see and experience the creativity of others, it sets off the fire of creativity within themselves.
Yes. So again, if you couldn't hear everything Jeriel was talking about, he was using this wonderful, vivid imagery in his language about fires igniting each other, that the energy of this new birth, the inspirational energy of that is catching, that it naturally flows from one heart and mind into another. And there's a modern term that I think is fitting here, and that's synergy. That what happens is that in this communion of spirit, new things emerge that wouldn't have emerged if each isolated individual had just kind of been doing their own thing, even as profound as that might have been for them. But that in the coming together, the fire grows. And the fire imagery is really important because, for me, one of the key symbols that fits with the idea of Renaissance is a phoenix. That phoenix that comes to its own demise on the nest that it builds and lights a flame, to reduce itself to ashes, which become the egg that then gives birth to the new life from the old. So there's a key concept too that I want to draw your attention to that actually fits well with what Doug was saying about the reverence for the past, is that the new always contains elements of the old. It keeps those things that transcend that previous incarnation and have proven their worthiness to be carried forward in the new incarnation. It's a kind of karma, in a way. Any other thoughts about the meanings or implications of the word Renaissance? Yes, brother.
It kind of reminds me of the word essence.
Ah,
And, the essence of the previous movie, so that would be, it would allow light to travel.
yeah.
And see the information and possibly, ideas that will allow.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. It's a very poetic way of looking at this. He was drawing the connection between the sound of the word Renaissance and the sound of the word essence, and how the idea of Renaissance is reconnecting with the essence and giving it an opportunity to remanifest in some new ways. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'd never thought of that before, never noticed it. As much as I love poetry, that had never occurred to me. So thank you for sharing that. Yes, brother. Oh, okay. So being more specifically Masonic, you're highlighting how we have been making a shift in many lodges or in many jurisdictions from just having what so many of us in the 20th century became familiar with and thought of as usual Masonry, to things like traditional observance, European concept, and so on. An idea of drawing out that essence and allowing it to flower in a new form that's not necessarily so new, but drawing on Doug's point again, reverences the past in some ways. Okay, good. This is good conversation. See, this is so much better than me just standing up here and droning on about what Renaissance means. We would have never heard this wonderful comment about the poetic connection between essence and Renaissance if it had just been me. So I want to draw attention to this idea of connecting with the past. I see a significant number of parallels between what's happening in today's shift in Masonry and what was happening in the 17th century. When we were making the transition, and by we, I'm speaking in the traditional, I'm speaking for the tradition of Freemasonry. We were making the shift from the operative craft into accepted Masonry, which would eventually become what we now call speculative Masonry. That period of the 1700s was radically significant. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of David Stevenson or Marcia Keith Schuchard, if I'm pronouncing her name properly. Both of these scholars have done really important work of showing what was happening, particularly within Scots Masonry in that period of the 1700s. Who it was that was being attracted to the operative craft and being accepted into the operative craft without being operative Masons. Now, some of you know the names like Elias Ashmole, Robert Moray. There's another one, David Ramsay, who was one of the most privy counselors of the King of Scotland during that time, a member of the royal court. And the royal court of Scotland at that time was very interested in the art of memory as it was being promulgated by Giordano Bruno. So this is not just rote memorization. This is the contemplative practice that involves a number of different memory techniques, not just to recall things specifically, but to bring together ideas, to bring together symbols, and to allow them to serve as vehicles of inspiration and intuition, some of those words that we've been talking about here, and even divine revelation. Now, we know that that art was required of all apprentices and fellows of the craft by the Master of Works in Scottish operative Masonry in 1599. We've got a record that that was required. You had to prove proficiency in the art of memory. But that wasn't the only contemplative practice that people were aware of at that time. These scholars that I was talking about earlier, and particularly Marcia Keith Schuchard, noted how many of these very same brothers were also learning about Kabbalah and Hermeticism, and were interested in alchemy. Not just what we might call operative alchemy, right? They were also interested in the symbolism of alchemy as it could be used allegorically. So this was a hugely transformative time in Masonic history. Our speculative Masonry that we are being initiated into today would not exist if those things hadn't been happening, if those men hadn't found something in the operative craft that connected with all these other things that they were interested in and was in fact integral to the overall development of what we now call esotericism in the West. You cannot divorce Freemasonry from that past. Now, for a long time, that was just a matter of speculation, largely. But we're now getting better scholarship, historical, and not biased by the idea that, oh, Masonry can't have anything to do with all of that. We've got more that's going to be coming forth, I'm sure, because there's still many records that haven't been opened. So I'm drawing a parallel between what was happening then and what's happening now. And I want to ask you, how do you see that? What's some evidence to you that we're in a phase of Masonic history that bears some similarities to what was going on in the 17th century, and particularly the early part of the 1600s? Jeriel.
The rise of interest in Masonic education and contemplative practices, and the fact that those things are also feeding into the restoration of observant practices that are going to give to the young men that are coming into our fraternity, coming into our doors from an outside that is in descending chaos. And I think we need to be putting all of our Masonic efforts into that, because I think that it will restore what Masonry has been.
All right. So Jeriel was making the connection of the rise of Masonic education, the rise of contemplative practice. And I want to draw attention to something that you highlighted. And that's the difference between what Masonry has to offer within its doors compared to what's happening in the world outside. That's another parallel with those 1700s, particularly in Great Britain. There was lots of conflict going on between England and Scotland at the time, and Masonry was seen by a lot of people as, on the one hand, an opportunity to kind of get intelligence on what the other side was doing, but on the other hand, an opportunity to also meet with people who had serious religious and political differences, but to meet together in peace for things that they regarded as higher principles and purposes. So I think that's a very significant parallel to where we are. Yes, brother.
So I think it runs parallel with singular systems that are at play, like larger ones, like for example, like point out that we're in general going to have to deal with as the individual experiencing life, right? But also I feel like it's maybe technical too, with technology, and maybe shifting between these paradigms. Because I think like we're exiting the paradigm and entering the
Yes.
paradigm. But the lodge itself maintains the paradigm that is outside the trends. And I think that's what Masonry has such an effect, because it goes towards universal principles that outlast those trends, cycles, or what's it called, paradigm shift.
Wonderful, wonderful. So this idea that, that there are eternal truths, what we might call a Sophia Perennis, right? A perennial wisdom. And that those transcend the political differences and the shifting of paradigms that you talked about. Definitely in the 17th century, there was a huge shift going on. There was a shift going on. It had already begun to move from what we would call Renaissance philosophies, Renaissance humanism, into the Enlightenment or modern philosophy, modernism. And so there was a big shift happening philosophically there about what it means to know, how we know, what's possible to know, and what's not possible to know. really big time of shift there, and also in attitudes about what's the role of human consciousness in all of that. So I think that's a really significant parallel. Any other parallels that you think you can see? Yes, brother.
I see a correlation between thought movement of the Renaissance, thought movement happening within not being judged for being interested in what used to be known.
Yes.
All the different aspects that masonry can.
I love that. I love that connection with free thinkers, which another term for free thinkers back in those times was libertine. And we use that word almost exclusively pejoratively these days. And it was kind of used pejoratively back then too, because they didn't really like free thinkers back then any more than most people really like free thinkers now. The consequences could be a little more severe back then, but Masonry offered a place where free thinkers could not only be welcome, but heard and have influence. And that's happening in Masonry again today. I've been a Mason for, well, we'll just say over 30 years. And because I'm not good at doing math in my head. So I've been a Mason for over 30 years. Bob Davis, another Mason for what, at least twice that long, right? We both remember a time when it would have been inconceivable to have an event like this. And even in jurisdictions that we're both familiar with, it would still be inconceivable. But aren't we seeing an explosion of these types of events happening all over the country? And now, not just within the United States, but things are starting to happen in Canada. There's a growing international connection that's happening. That's another parallel to the 1700s and all of the international connections that were happening with that movement from the operative into accepted and speculative Masonry. My goodness, the Swedes were involved. I mean, it's just, there was all kinds of stuff happening there internationally, sharing of ideas. Let's go back over to David.
There's two jumps I want to make. One is the 17th, 18th century visions hierarchy and visions secular faith and the transition of individuals sharing spaces together to now having a room filled with individuals of many faiths and backgrounds sharing spaces together.
Yes.
In particular, in the last 20 years, to your point with having forums such like this, is people have taken, an act of the divine to organize a conference like this in any jurisdiction. To now being able to turn on a Zoom stream,
Yes.
connect with people at the same time.
Yes.
All over the globe. And this is something that, as far as the breadth and depth of the transition is happening at a very expeditious rate.
Yes.
And I think we can interact.
I love that. I love the highlighting the technological revolution and how it's affecting us as a fraternity and a tradition. And it goes back to the other brother's point about the kinds of transitions that were happening back then. We're not only political, but also technological in the 17th century. Mitch.
Everything that's been said is just so historically targeted, and I just want to amplify something that you made reference to a few minutes earlier. Not only are we seeing, in general, an outcropping of renewal of the individual search and technology that aids and abets that search, but apropos the point you made earlier, and this is very parallel to the Renaissance historically, we're seeing a proliferation of
texts and ideas that are giving us new windows on the past in ways that previous generations
Yes.
imagined. You know, when I was a kid, I grew up in a more or less Orthodox Jewish community. You never very much about Kabbalah at all.
Yeah.
You talk about Kabbalah, you get sent to the principal's office. And nowadays, in this generation, there's a tremendous flowering of study of Kabbalah, both from people who are from Jewish and non-Jewish tradition.
Yes.
Literally since 1992, I would say we're seeing the first really truly good solid translations into English of Hermetic literature. We've had English translations in the past, of course, and they had their greater and lesser qualities, but we're in our generation, we're receiving the first really
Yes.
fine, broad English translations of Hermetic literature. We're retranslating or translating for the first time astrological works from the Persian and Hellenic traditions. So there really is a very concrete historical paradigm.
Thank you for drawing all of that out. Yeah, yes. The availability of new old literature. That's a wonderful, wonderful point. All right. So the idea of a rebirth implies death. Something is dying. Something is passing away. So that's my next question. What is it that we experience dying and passing away in our fraternity in this phase of its life? What's that? Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Yeah. The idea that there's only one right way to think about things and only one right way to do things. That's going away. And it's scary for some people, as death always is. That passing away means letting go of something that some people have made a central part of their life. And I think that deserves to be respected and treated with dignity and honor, even if some of us see the positive side of that death, the opportunity it makes for rebirth. What else? What other kinds of dying are we seeing?
Speaking of the death and rebirth in terms of the phoenix you brought up earlier, that there's one part of the myth of the phoenix that it is a singular bird.
Yes.
Not a flock of birds.
Yes.
Singular, so the individuality, the individual journey, and not being conformity to everybody else's way of thinking, finding one's own path.
Wow, isn't that something? To think about Masonry being the nest in which each of us is a phoenix. That's a powerful idea. Thank you, Doug. Let's go to Jeriel.
I was just reminded of a conference that I went to at the Philosophical Research Society. It was right before the pandemic, and Dr. Stephen Keller was talking. And the question and answer, the question was put to him, what do you see in the future as being like Brother Escott about a paradigm shift? And he said that he thought that what it would be the shift from looking for God out there, looking for God in here.
Esoteric.
Yeah.
Within. Yes. Nice. So he was talking about the shift of, there's a paradigm shift, a basic philosophical paradigm shift, that ever since the so-called Enlightenment age, more and more emphasis has been put on finding truth out there and ignoring the internal avenues to truth. Even though they're still working, we're just not going to pay any attention to them. So that is a shift. And that's not only happening within the Masonic fraternity, it's also happening in the outside culture as well, that people are beginning to look more for that sort of thing. So
And I think that's also related to what we talked about before, of going back to the past. If you go back to those traditions that you were just talking about, they've been teaching that same thing, that the first
Yes.
principle of esotericism is to know yourself.
Yes.
And I think that that's a very important thing that Masonry has to offer for young men today, is a path forward within a group of men, finding your way inward to understand the outer world.
Yeah. There's this, one of Plato's dialogues is called Phaedrus. There's this wonderful moment in that dialogue in which they're talking about the mystery schools. So the correlate to Freemasonry in their time, maybe much grander in some ways, but nonetheless a correlate. And they're talking about the symbolism and the meaning of the mysteries and everything. And Socrates says about this idea of connecting the myths that are used in those mysteries with history and with, the idea that something happened and how did that happen and what actually literally occurred. And Socrates basically says, look, I don't have time for that. I couldn't care less about the historical connections. You want to know why? Because the injuncture at the Temple of Delphi says, know thyself, and I'm fully occupied with that. That's all. I can't work on anything else. That's big enough. And he says that with reverence to the mysteries. He says that everything he's done in his life is so that he could be counted among the initiates of the mysteries. That's how much respect that he has for those traditions. But he was talking about the same problem that so many of us are talking about today. It's fascinating. I love it. And I saw a hand over here. Yes.
So, Brother Chuck, I think one of the things that is dying is what we can kindly call passive masonry. In that there are a number of aspects of Freemasonry that a lot of engage in, whether it's ritual and education, whether it's fellowship, whether it's presence and benevolence in their communities. And the lodges that do none of that well are the things that are done. Part of this.
All right. So Chris Murphy was just talking about what he called passive masonry. Basically, the idea is you show up, do the degree rituals when you have to. Maybe not worry about how well they're done. Certainly not worry about what they mean. Pay the bills if you can, and go home. Or maybe sit around, drink coffee, and play checkers or something like that. Yeah. That approach to just passively maintaining the structure of the tradition is one of the things that's dying. Again, a kind of Masonic experience that has been important to some of our brethren. That's been meaningful to them. Let me see. I want to make sure that I give some. Yes, brother, over here.
I would say, speaking for people too, is there's a lot of us that spent our 20s in the military and special operations, jumping out their 20s and blowing kids up, and out of that decade of our life, spent a handful of those in Iraq and Afghanistan, partaking in and bearing witness to a lot of death and destruction, a lot of violence. And those of us that when you come back, physically, a lot of us are absolutely crippled and not dead inside. And then a lot of us find our way to the lodge where we find these ideals and just transcendent beliefs, like you said, that are outside of everything else. And it's some stable thing. We come in here and meet other like-minded individuals and a lot of guys that have similar experiences. Vietnam guys, we're lucky enough, some World War II Korea guys. And it's a little something else. I don't know. It wasn't the camaraderie or anything like that kept me in or interested, but it was more the ideals and the higher purpose and the depth.
Yes.
Of everything. So I don't know. I think a lot of us in there are own.
I really appreciate you sharing that, brother, for many, many reasons. And And there is a parallel there too between now and what was happening in the 17th century. The 30 Years' War was horrible. And by the time it was over, people were really hungry for something besides war. And Freemasonry offered them something besides war. So wonderful parallel there. And it's not just a personal venue for healing, but also a communal venue for healing, because ultimately the two cannot be separated from each other. That violates every basic understanding of unity to think that we as individuals can heal without communal healing, and that the community can heal without individual healing. And so I really appreciate you drawing our attention to that. Thank you. One more, and then I'm going to move on. I saw a hand back here that hasn't spoken yet. So,
We bring up terms like person, kind of rely on our current layer open to what persons are. We try to put that in a circular process. And we look at, particularly, really my open thing of we're trying to see it as a one monolithic thing. We make it an interconnected network of so many different parts. That to figure out what that depth is, probably not just one thing. It's a multitude.
it is, yes.
And so I think we have to expand to look at all of those.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Mike. Thank you for sharing it, that there are many kinds of deaths that are happening, and that they're happening in different ways in different locations. One of the wise things that Bob Davis always says is that, Masonry is local. And it's really easy to think of it as this global monolithic kind of thing. People outside the United States kind of think Americans are kind of funny about that tendency, has been my experience. We like to think that what's happening in the United States and whatever corner of the United States that we live in is what's happening everywhere. And there's always a little bit of truth to that, but like any good myth, it's not totally factual. I'm going to be running out of time quickly, and so I just want to ask you to now shift your thinking to this idea of nurturing. What it means to nurture a rebirth. Because we can get so caught up in focused on just understanding what's happening and trying to create the future, which is really, we have a hand in that, right? But we forget that we're in the midst of mystery all the time. For those of you who are parents, you know that you can have all kinds of visions for your child, but ultimately their life is theirs, and who they become is not up to you. The masonry of the future is our child. We must nurture it, try to inspire it, try to imbue it with virtues, with visions of possibilities, with hope, with faith, with love. But we can't control it. That's beyond our power. And so what does it mean to nurture? And how can you, as an individual, nurture that rebirth? What do you, as a unique human being, have to offer our tradition as it goes through this process of Renaissance? I'd like for you to take that question seriously. Maybe even start trying right now in your own mind to answer that question. I'm going to leave you with one more poem on this idea of nurturing. Awakening in the night's dark midst, from dreamless sleep, we hear a call. Then, wrapped in silent, deep blue mist, we pass into an ancient hall. About us hung in golden frames, about us hung in golden frames and peering from mosaic tiles, loom kindred faces lit by flames, reflected in their knowing smiles. Around the crown, in bas-relief, are carved their mythic memories, their wars and quests, their joy and grief, their treks across the sapphire seas. Great sacrifices they have made, preparing this old hallowed place, securing with both love and blade this temple filled with art and grace. Through adytum and portico, soft voices echo from each wall. The epic songs from muses flow that eons hence we'll still recall. Those mortals from the earth's damp sod, their fruitful legends now grown ripe, have each transformed into a god, the icon of an archetype. Within their gaze, we cross the floor to pursue our spirit's mission. Past azure veils, a pearly door guards the font of all tradition. With simple faith, we strike the knocks that sound the driven seeker's plea. With thunderous quakes, the cosmic locks shake down each soul to bended knee. The portal opens with a knell into the depths of virgin space. And here, dumbfounded, we must dwell upon an ageless, profiled face. There, from its clear, eternal eye, a cascade of light comes streaming. As from a prism, bright rays fly to illuminate God's dreaming. Now, on this rainbow span of light, we find our fitting harmonies, wherein our flames of will ignite and dance upon the heavenly breeze. Then, drawn within the dazzling swell, we let the currents carry us back toward where our sparks once fell, though now with renewed consciousness. Returning through our hero's shrine, we sense the rally of their souls, and joining with their lodge divine, our names are added to its rolls. Beneath the brightest of all moons, across the mighty banks of time, they pass to us their greatest boons, that we may do the work sublime. So, exiting our sanctum's porch, once more upon our odysseys, we bear with us a sacred torch, a mystic word, and magic keys. Now sailing back through night's black mist, as the great architect so deems, we stir in morning's amethyst to rise awake in daylight dreams. Thank you.